Now we will look at Neoclassicism and Romanticism in art. These two movements happened more or less simultaneously from the end of 18th century into the 19th century of Europe. So, Neoclassicism comes first to Romanticism. Neoclassicism emerged as a reaction to Rococo art. Okay, when it comes to art particularly, there was a shift in the taste, shift in the aesthetic approach towards making art and painting particularly. It was inspired, and this particular kind of shift emerged as a critique of Rococo art and the time, the socio-political time that Rococo was happening. So, why Neoclassicism emerged? Neoclassicism emerged because of certain very important excavations, some very important reinvention or reapproach of classical arts, classical philosophy and classical politics, like the political theory, right. So, it was a sort of a like Renaissance, but with a different kind of an approach now, where the historians, the philosophers, the theoreticians as well as the artists, they have looked back to the classical times. So, which is why it is called Neoclassicism or the Neoclassical age, and this Neoclassical age coincides with something called the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, this was the time of enlightenment. Enlightenment is not something like Buddha's enlightenment or the spiritual enlightenment, but here enlightenment movement was a philosophical movement which introduced rationality and scientific thinking rather than the belief, rather than the belief in religion or belief in some kind of a faith with which we understand the nature, right. So, the Age of Enlightenment is also a sort of a scientific revolution, So, that in fact marks the beginning of what we call the modern age, right, because that also introduced new political thinking or introduced a sort of an approach towards society and towards the responsibility of an individual. The idea of responsibility of an individual is political thinking, right. So, it introduces this idea of individual responsibility, and that individual responsibility is informed by rational thinking, right. So, Neoclassicism is closely linked with the idea of rationalism, the rational thought, and it is not about imagination or it is not about the belief, but it is the rational thinking that an individual cultivates. He knows or he learns by looking at the nature, by reading, by studying, and this is a sort of an effort. This is an effort of an individual to kind of expand his knowledge, and through that expansion of the knowledge is you can see enlightenment of your own self, and this is the kind of approach that emerged during the 18th century, right. This is a very important moment, and the Age of Enlightenment also coincides with the Neoclassicism, the age of Neoclassical era, right. So, when it comes to how they have discovered, we know that from Renaissance onwards, artists and various other people, there were travels, there were tours conducted to these places in Rome, right, particularly, and Greece, where all the classical architectures, all the dilapidated classical architecture was lying down, right. It was available for the artists, architects, and we know Brunelleschi went there, we know Michelangelo went there, we know all these important Renaissance artists have went to the Roman and Greece areas, I mean, Italy largely, but specific regions of Italy, the Rome and the Greece, and the cities, the ancient cities of Rome and Greece, where they could find the architecture, right? And these tours were very important from Renaissance onwards, and they continue into the later era, later times, and that continues. And this particular tour becomes more and more important during this time, also during the time of neoclassical age. So, for example, look at this slide that you have on your screen. It is a very popular image that was in circulation at that point of time. So, the travelers, whether it is artists or whoever, they would collect such images. So, this is what? This is Venice, right? And you can see the river, you can see the architecture of the Renaissance Venice. Actually, the architecture you see on the extreme left is the Gothic architecture. So, such images of Italy got circulated, right? Such images of these important places of both the Renaissance cities, where Renaissance happened, as well as the ancient Greco-Roman places, right? So, this particular image by Antonio Canaletto is an example of such images that we found popular. Like you go somewhere, you collect these popular images, that the practice is still there. So, at that point of time, these are the kind of images which were very popular for these traveling artists and travelers who would collect such images. And what else was happening? At that point of time, it was during the 18th century. 18th century is a very important period in the context of European history and in the context of the modern European history, where and which 18th century, the excavations, the archaeological excavations and writings about the antiquities of the ancient Europe, that which is Greece and Rome, the antiquities of Greece and Rome really led to a sort of a revival of the Greco-Roman classical forms. So, for example, the next slide that you see on the screen, there are very important books, and along with the books or within those books we have images. The images that were drawn and painted in these locations, for example, Athens or Herculaneum, or all these places, these draftsmen, these archaeologists, the people who were interested in these antiquities, they went there, they sat there, they spent time, and they kind of documented them and they compiled. So, you see a particular knowledge is produced, right? A knowledge about the ancient classical times were produced, not only architecture but also painting as well as philosophy. And along with the philosophy, the political structure, the knowledge of the political structure as well as the social structure. So, you have a renewed interest in the holistic sort of an interest in the classical Greece, right. So, these are the three examples as you see, the antiquities of Herculaneum, another is this French name of 15-volume work. So, huge amount of work that was done in the early 18th century. Bernard de Montfort, right. So, Bernard de Montfort wrote these books about the antiquities, the antique times, right. And later you have the antiquities of Herculaneum. Herculaneum was a very important town which was discovered during this time, and another city was another town was Pompeii. And in these two cities, in these two towns, we found very important and beautiful mural paintings. So, in the houses of these towns, we see elaborate mural paintings with very well drawn and very skillfully done paintings with elaborate figuration, right. So, these paintings actually influence the neoclassical painting. This is an important point to note. The paintings of Herculaneum and Pompeii, the towns that were discovered during this time, those paintings influenced the neoclassical painting along with the Renaissance that we have, right. Another important book is the Antiquities of Athens, which was done in 1762, right, by two excavators, two explorers rather, James Stewart and Nicholas Revett. So these two explorers spent time in Athens, and they meticulously have drawn, drafted the plans and the elevation, and they documented almost the antiquities of Athens, right. So what do we see over there were the remains of classical civilizations, and the recoveries were made available to the public. So through these, the public could be seen. Not everybody could go to the ancient Greece, right. Not everybody could travel to the these towns of Greece and Rome. So the public got to know about the ancient civilization, the classical civilizations, through these books, and the artists carefully have engraved reproductions. So the engravings, as you know, was the medium for reproductions. It was not photography. Now we have in the books different kind of photographs, very good images, but at that point of time the printing was made through engraving of the plates. You have, it's a technique of printmaking. You can see, you can know it in that context, but engravings were used to accompany, to correlate with the text. So you have text as well as the image. So public got to know about the knowledge and the wealth of the classical civilizations through these new research and through books, right. So an important philosopher and historian at this point of time was Winckelmann, and as you see on the slide on your screen, Johann Joachim Winckelmann was a German philosopher, and he is very important in terms of creating an interest in the ancient Greece, right. So he wrote some important books called the History of Ancient Art, and then the Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture, right. So he advocated artists should imitate the Greek painting and sculpture, right, and to learn from Greek painting and sculpture. So he said that a painting and sculpture should contain some kind of a balance, some kind of a grandeur, right, but not the kind of grandeur that you see in Baroque or Rococo. Here the grandeur should be balanced and it should be austere, right. So you have a sense of grandeur, but at the same time it is balanced with certain kind of a classicism, right. So Winckelmann is a very important figure. He wrote books on history, art history and philosophy. So he was basically a German philosopher, right. So moving on to the next slide, you see on your screen you have two images. So these two images are two pages from the book called Ruins of Palmyra, right. Ruins of Palmyra was produced by Robert Wood in 1753. So what he did in between 1749 and 1751, he stayed there, right. So he is called antiquarian. So the people who were interested in antiquities are called antiquarians. If I am interested in an antique piece, that may be a sculpture or a vase or an architecture, like you see on the screen, these two examples of the drawing. So Robert Wood was an antiquarian, and John Bovary was another, as well as James Dawkins, right. So these three antiquarians, Robert Wood, John Bovary and James Dawkins, they began expedition to view the ancient sites of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is Palmyra, which was not accessible to anyone, right, which was not accessible to tourists. It is not Greece or Rome, but Palmyra was a place where Romans invaded and established their rule, right. So, which is the eastern part of Mediterranean, which is quite away from the mainland Europe. So, which had hitherto been viewed as inaccessible, right. So, it was not, the tourists could not be accessed. So, these three antiquarians, when they spend the time over there and they produce these beautiful, very accurate drawings and plans of the dilapidated architecture. So, this is an example of the kind of knowledge that the people were getting to see at that point of time. So, we have seen a sort of a kind of an introduction to neoclassicism. Neoclassicism emerged because of a holistic interest in the classical antiquity, right, and that happened because through certain research, certain antiquarian efforts and the production of books along with the images and text, right. So, the artists were able to access this knowledge, right, as well as the artists could see the images of the paintings of Pompeii as well as Herculaneum. So, when it comes to painting, what we see in painting is the mythological and biblical themes were done, but in the modern context. Though the themes appear to be antiquarian, the themes appear to be located in the classical antiquity, but it talks about the modern context. It talks about the context of 18th century Europe, right, and we will see when we see the examples of painting, we can see how that is happening. And retelling of story to emphasize modern idea, right. So, you tell the story that may be located in Roman times or the Greek times, but you tell it in such a way that the people of the present time can associate, and the story of that painting is related to the present political context. So, what happens is there is a kind of a subtext. Subtext is something that which is sort of behind the thing that appears. Subtext is something that which is not very evident in the painting, but you can understand by looking at the painting, right. So, subtext is not quite is the theme of the painting, it is something that is behind as an intention, right. So, subtext referring to people, situations or political states. So, this aspect is very important in the context of neoclassical painting. And when it comes to compositions, neoclassical painting differed radically from the Rococo or the Baroque painting, right. So, when compositions become very symmetrical and balanced, right, and again the linear perspective is brought back and carefully constructed backgrounds were used, right. So, unlike the dynamism that we saw in Baroque or the kind of pale flowery sort of palettes that the color palette that we saw in Rococo, what happens in neoclassicism is there is a sense of theatricality, grandiosity, balance and symmetry comes back, right. So, these are the things when it comes to painting in the context of neoclassicism. And as we know that already in France and London, in Britain, the art academies were established, right. So, neoclassicism was quickly academized, it was adopted into the academy, into the academic kind of language of painting, right. So, we have seen in the context of antiquarian practices where the past was revived, renewed and known, and how it reflected in painting, right. What are the influences that painting has absorbed. And simultaneously, if you look at the next slide, what we see in painting is invisible brushwork. We do not see the brushwork. We have seen the examples of, if you look at the examples of Rembrandt or Franz Hals, or look at some of the Baroque and Rococo artworks where we see the visible brushworks, the brushworks are visible, but when you look at neoclassicism, the brushwork is clear, you do not see the brushwork, you do not see the marks of the brush, right. So, along with that, you have the evolution of scientific art of the Enlightenment. Here the art practice is tempered with scientific approach, right. Standard to give modern portraits, ancient clothes and pose. So, even the modern portraits, you have portraits of the people of 18th century, but the clothes and the pose comes from the ancient time, from the earlier times. So, there is a kind of a combination, you know. So, the epic contemporary events with modern accuracy. You have these epic contemporary events were shown in a very grand manner, right, but with a very accuracy of the evidence, you know, it is not imagined, but it is accurate. So, that accuracy is planned in the very composition itself, and you can see that when we look at the paintings, right. So, let us move to the paintings. This slide that you see on the screen is by Angelica Kauffmann. Angelica Kauffmann was a woman artist, and she painted this particular painting where Cornelia presenting her, the title is Cornelia presenting her children to her as her treasures. So, the story is simple, and the story is about a neighbor comes to Cornelia's house, and she, as a matter of exchange, she's showing her jewelry. As you can see, she is showing her jewelry as her possession, as her wealth, and asks Cornelia to show her jewelry. So, instead of showing her jewelry, Cornelia calls her sons, two sons. So, here the mother is showing her sons as her wealth, right. So, here it is about the virtue and the virtue in which the sons are raised, but not about the jewelry, right. So, the value and the wealth is invested not in these material jewelry, but in the value of the virtues, right. The sons are not only the sons of Cornelia, but the sons are going to be part of the nation, right. They are going to participate in the upliftment of nation or in the war if it is required. This is very much like the Greek context. In the classical Greece, the sons, the men were seen as the men who will defend the country, right, who will save the country, who are powerful, whose energy, whose, you know, existence is dedicated for the nation. So, that is the idea. The sons here are not just a matter of two boys, just sons, but here two sons means they are supposed to dedicate themselves for the country, to defend the country, to sort of dedicate themselves for the good of the country. So, there is a sort of a subtext, you know, there is a sort of a subtext which is not very clearly represented, which is not illustrated in the painting, but it could be understood, and people understood at that point of time what it means. So, the virtues of the Greek classical antiquity, that civilization was brought back and identified and sort of used to narrate in the paintings, right. And if you look at the way the physiognomy, the figures are painted, you look at the faces, when you look at the faces and the way the anatomy is painted, and also the way the dress is painted. So, the dress code is very much the dress code of the classical antiquity. It is the Greek dresses that they are wearing, and the portraits are also very much like the Greek classical portraits, right. So, the physiognomy, the body type is very much like the Greek classical physiognomy, and you can see this painting reflects both the virtues as well as the pictorial language, the visual language of the classical times, right. Let us move to the next slide, and this is a famous artist and a very important artist of neoclassicism called Jacques-Louis David or Jacques-Louis David. So, this painting is called Oath of Horatius. Again, this story comes from the Roman times. This particular painting though it is done in the 18th century, late 18th century, but the story is located in the Roman times. So it is about the conflict of Rome and Alba, right? So there was a conflict between Rome and Alba going on for some years, and they sat together and they thought that they will resolve the conflict. It is about that. But before going into the story, let us look at the image. Let us look at the painting. Right in the center, you have the father figure, the figure in the center, holding 3 swords, and on the left side, you have 3 masculinely painted sons, right? 3 young men are taking oath, touching the swords, right? And they are standing right, straight and erect, right? So you can see there is a strong balance, right? They are erect, very straight, and their bodies are quite strong. They express the strength, and the bodies are quite attentive, and the musculature is very expressive, and they are taking oath. And you can see all that masculine power expressed through this particular kind of a coming together, right? And the vanishing point, if you kind of draw a vanishing point, it actually meets on the point where the swords are held, you know, right at the point where the swords are held. And this is an expression of dedication, right? So the 3 sons are submitting themselves, they are taking oath that they will submit their lives for Rome, for the Rome to be victorious. And they are submitting, and the father is the witness of that submission, right? So you have this extreme amount of masculinity and valor expressed right in the center. And if you move to the right side of the canvas of the image, you have 3 women kind of, you know, composed, and they are in agony. They are kind of crying, right? They are not showing that strength, right? And the way they are painted, you have a sort of a curvaceous sort of a treatment. Their lines are not strong or erect like the men that you see. Their lines are quite flowing, you know. There is a sort of a feminine effect. So you can see this clear gender sort of dichotomy here, the men shown with this extreme amount of masculinity, where women here are very feminine, delicate, and, you know, the lines are quite free flowing, very curved lines that you have. So this is the visual composition, and this is set, the entire composition is set in this architecture, as you see, which is again a Roman architecture. You have the arches and the columns, which are very simple. They are not very dramatic like you see in the context of Baroque or the earlier compositions. It's very simple, very austere, but it also looks like a theatrical set, right? It is because the way the drama is happening, it's more dramatic, right? So neoclassicism has this quality of theater, a quality of drama, you know, in the compositions. So the story of the painting is the 3 sons of the Curtius family, Quiretus family from Alba, right? So the 3 sons of Quiretus family and the 3 sons of 𝗳𝗏 family, they sort of would come together, they would fight it out, and they would settle the conflict, right? So that was the idea. And what more to it is the familial relations. So both these families had a familial relation where, you know, the sister of 𝗳𝗏 was married to one of the sons of Quiretus, and one of the sisters of Quiretus was about to be married to one of the 𝗳𝗏 sons. So this interesting familial relation was also there. So which is why the men are more masculine, more valorous here. Women are shown weeping because one of their husbands are going to die, right? So the sacrifice, so the entire story is very dramatic, where it is implied with sacrifice, patriotism, sacrifice not for anything but for the sake of nation, right. And this story is the Roman story, right, but it is painted in the 18th century. It is to kind of, the subtext here, if I bring back the subtext is to submit yourself for the sake of nation. Here the painting is telling people, right, if you can read into it, the idea is the people should submit. So this is the virtue. As someone who is living in France, you as a citizen of France, you should be having this virtue and patriotism to submit yourself and sacrifice your desires for the sake of nation. So this is the kind of subtext that it has, right. So you have a sense of nationalism also emerging at this point of time. So painting here is not only a matter of expressing a narrative, but it is also kind of telling something else. It is about patriotism and it is about submission to your nation. So now the next slide by the same artist, it also has the same sort of intention and the subtext. It is the death of Socrates, right. So without spending much time for analysis, so we have analyzed two paintings and it continues, you can see the same thing happening. Socrates was a Greek philosopher, right, and he was accused by the Athenian government of impiety and corrupting the young through his teaching. So he through his philosophy, it seems he corrupted the young men. So that was the allegation of Athenian government. So he was offered the choice. Then he was put in the prison and he was asked, you should stop this, you should renounce your beliefs, or you should choose the death, right, because of the treason. So he was considered that he was doing this unjust, right, he was going against the government, against the state, that which is treason. So either you denounce, either you kind of stop doing all this, or you die. And Socrates chose death. He did not stop his beliefs, he did not renounce his beliefs, but he said, whatever I said is correct and I can die for whatever I said. I believe in whatever I said and I will not say that I don't believe, I will renounce, but I will die. So he chose death for the sake of his beliefs. So that is a virtue. If you believe in something, you don't say that, okay, you don't compromise when it comes to death, but he chose death without compromising his beliefs and his ethics. So this is the story. And again, the composition is quite dramatic, where you have Socrates sort of showing one finger up, it's a very curious kind of a gesture. He's sitting on the bed and he's taking the goblet of poison, so he's taking the glass of poison, and you have people really crying because they feel helpless, and it is set in this prison sort of an environment and very simple architecture, right. And if you go from the left side of the canvas, you have a sort of an entrance and you can go up through the steps, right. So but it is again composed in this dramatic manner, right. It almost like a theater happening in front of you with the kind of light that is falling, and the kind of physiognomy, the body type is very much classical in its expression, right. So moving to the next slide, again by the same artist called David. It is a political painting. I mean, it was an expression of, it was a contemporary event, unlike, the story is also contemporary, unlike 𝗂𝗏 or death of Socrates. This is death of Mara. It is again the same subtext is there, sacrifice, you submit yourself for nation and all. So Mara was a writer and a friend of David actually. He was tragically assassinated in 1793. So he was again martyred. So it is a kind of a martyrdom, right? You became a martyr for the sake of nation, right? So here David represented or depicted this revolutionary figure of Mara as a martyr, right? And how did he die? He was partaking in revolution, and the first French Revolution happened in 1798. So this is the moment of revolution, right? So he was actually killed by someone called 𝗧𝗦𝗃𝗺𝗃. 𝗧𝗦𝗃𝗺𝗃 came to him, and then she was talking nicely, and she represented the ruling class, the ruling section. And 𝗧 was 𝗧 was a writer, he was a physician himself, and he was very active in politics, and he was running a journal, and he was writing against the oppression of the ruling class. So he was a rival to the political faction, right? So 𝗧𝗦𝗃𝗺𝗃 comes and stabs him to death, right? So he was in his medical bath, and if you look at the composition, he is actually sitting in his medical bath because he had a skin infection, and doctors suggested him to sit in that bath. So the bath is basically a medicinal bath. He was needed to sit in that so that the infection doesn't grow. So he organized his working place within the bath, and you can see that he's actually sitting in the bath, and you have a sort of a box and writing instruments and all. So, and the painting shows as if 𝗂𝗽𝗱 just killed him, and you can see the knife with the blood stains on it is lying down on the floor, and you can see he's been stabbed, and he has written just a letter, and you can see he's holding the stylus, and it's very simple a composition but very effective, right? So the top portion is almost blank, it is blank, there is nothing, and all your focus is concentrated on the face of 𝗧 and the body of 𝗧. And note the way the hand is falling. The hand is falling very similar to the sculpture of Pieta by Michelangelo, right? So it is a kind of a sacrifice that 𝗧 had done for the sake of nation, for the sake of revolution, right? So this is again not a historical sort of a, or historical in the sense the ancient history or the mythological or biblical theme, but you see the way it is painted both in terms of the mood and the composition. It elevated the death of 𝗧, the figure of 𝗧, as if he is equated to the Christ, right? So he is elevated to the composition that we see of Christ or the historical scenes, right? So this is a very important sort of a move that David did in this painting, where he is sort of elevating the death of 𝗧 to the almost like the sacrifice of Christ, right? So which is why this is a very important painting. And now let us move to the next artist, who is Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, right? This is one painting, and we have another painting by him. This is Apotheosis of Homer, and he painted it in the early 19th century, 1827, right? Ingres was highly influenced by the Renaissance tradition, and particularly Raphael. And you can compare this painting that you see on the screen with, for example, the School of Athens by Raphael. And you see, if you draw a vanishing point, the vanishing point becomes like it forms right at the point where he's been crowned, right? So it is the story of Homer, it is a story part of Homer, and you see Ingres is using all the painters that he was influenced by. You can see Nicolas Poussin, you can see Raphael, you can see Michelangelo, you can see most of these very important Renaissance as well as Baroque painters, right? So it is not about, so though the story is coming from the Greek times, he is contemporizing the story, right? And the way the architecture is used as a backdrop, and it is a Greek temple, right. So, it is having this pyramidical structure. You can actually draw a sort of a triangle, and that triangle is very much a sort of a equilateral triangle. So, you have this sort of a pyramidical structure, and the same structure echoes at the pediment at the back with the architecture, right. So, again this is a very dramatic sort of a moment, and the drama is sort of laid out very interestingly in this, right. And the physiognomy, the body type is very much the classical body type, right. So, let us move to the next slide, as we have sort of elaborated on the principles of painting and the subtext and all the other aspects. We can now quickly move with the images. The next image that you see is Odalisque, right, La Grande Odalisque by again Ingres. He painted it in 1814, slightly earlier, and it's a very interesting painting. Odalisque is a figure of the East for them, right. In the Eastern Moorish tradition, or the Eastern Mediterranean tradition, or the East where the Islamic rulers were ruling, Odalisque was a figure in the harem, right, where she was there to satisfy the sexual needs of the king, right. She was very intelligent. She would also participate in the political decisions, but mainly she was part of the zanana, the harem, for the sexual needs of the king, and she would have all these skills to satisfy the king with erotic pleasures. So, this was the figure of Odalisque, and Odalisque became very famous and very popular in Europe, and a figure of exotic interest, right. And this is a different theory, what is exotic interest, that happened at that point of time. But anyway, coming back to the image, Ingres painted this image of Odalisque, and he used certain amount of distortion, and you can see that, the way the figure is looking back, and the body is sort of stretched and made to look elegant and elongated, and the light is falling right on the body, where it makes it more sensuous and more focused, right. And Odalisque is set in this grand sort of a setting, where she is placed reclining on the bed, and you have a grand curtain, right. So, he used brilliant yet delicate palette, right, and you have a sensuous line with to marry the color of Romanticism and the clarity of Neoclassicism. So, Ingres is a figure who is shifting from the Neoclassicism into Romanticism, right. This is not about patriotism, this does not have a subtext, but this he painted by hearing and reading about the figure of Odalisque. He never went to Persia or Turkey. So, Turkey, it is in Turkey you have the figure of Odalisque very was in practice, right, but he never went to Turkey, but he read and he heard about the Odalisque through the travelers who went there and who wrote about it. So, which is a shift here in this painting. You see a shift towards Romanticism. Romanticism is again towards something that you do not have, but you sort of exoticize it, right. You think about it, you idealize it. It is not about rationality, it is not about empiricism, it is not about what you see, but it is more about what you imagine. So, Romanticism has something to do with imagination, right. So, he is imagining Odalisque in this particular setting, right. Let us move to the next slide. After painting, we can see a sculpture here by Canova. Canova was a Napoleon's favorite sculptor, Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite sculptor, and many sculptures he did for him. And this particular sculpture was actually of the sister of Napoleon, right. So, Napoleon's sister wanted to pose like this, right, like a Roman goddess, like Venus actually. So, you can see here Pauline Borghese, the sister of Napoleon, is posing like Venus, right. So she wanted to depict herself. So she wanted Canova to depict herself as Venus, and you can see it is very close to what we saw earlier, right, odalisque. The posture is very much commonly used at that point of time. So you can see here, though the portrait is of Pauline Borghese, but the body type and the posture is very much like the classical Greek sort of a body type, right, the physiognomy and the expression and the garment and all the related features. So let us move now towards what is Romanticism, right. So before moving to Romanticism, let us look at the differentiation between Neoclassicism and Romanticism. And in the next slide, you have a sort of a table where we can see the distinction between Neoclassicism and Romanticism. What we saw in Neoclassicism is an emphasis on history, an emphasis on the Greek classical forms and order. So in this slide you see Neoclassicism, when it comes to values, is order and solemnity, right, and Romanticism, intuition, emotion and imagination. Romanticism is more closely linked with imagination, Neoclassicism linked with order and empiricism, what you know, what you see, and solemnity, right. It is not dramatic, it is not very expressive, but it is containing in yourself. And what is the inspiration for Neoclassicism? It is classical Rome, patriotism, and we saw that in 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, and courage, honor, right, courage to fight, courage to stand and defend your nation, and the honor that you carry. And inspiration for Romanticism is medieval times, right, not the classical Rome, but the medieval times and Baroque eras, where you can see in Baroque you have this very dramatic sort of expression, and Middle and Far East. So they are looking at an entirely different era, the medieval times, Gothic, Romanesque, Byzantine. So these movements, these eras, and Baroque, right. So when it comes to subjects, it is the Greek and Roman history, and we have seen that in the context of David, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, Socrates, death of Socrates, and other, there are several other paintings that he did. And when it comes to Romanticism, the subjects are legends, exotica, nature and violence. So we can see this when we look at Romanticism. It is nature that becomes very important for Romantics, and exotica, and we can see that, we have seen that in Ingres, where the odalisque was very exotic, right, and the legends. It is not what you know, but it is the legend that existed. So technique, what is the technique? Stressed on drawing with lines, not color, no trace of brush strokes, right. When it comes to Romanticism, unrestrained, you can see artists painted without any restraint, they painted very freely, right. The color was very rich and the brush strokes were very visible, we can see when we look at Romantic painting. So the role of art, how they imagined the role of art: morality, uplifting, morally uplifting and inspirational, right. The art should be inspirational, and you can see that whether it is 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 or Death of Mara, you see, you look at the painting and you draw inspiration, right. And when it comes to Romanticism, it is dramatic, carry viewer away. It is to kind of take into these imagined unrealistic ambiences, right. It is more about imagination and experience of imagination, right. And composition, most figures in foreground, right, figures are in the foreground, and the background would have some kind of an architecture or mostly architecture. And in the context of Romanticism, use of diagonal, crowded compositions. So it is not the solemn order and balance, so you have dramatic diagonal sort of compositions, right. So best known artists are Jacques-Louis David when it comes to Neoclassicism, and Romanticism you have Eugene Delacroix, you have Goya, and you have Géricault and various other artists we can see now, right. So let us quickly move to the images. So we have some artists, initial artists, who sort of move from the neoclassical painting to the romantic painting. So from neoclassical painting to romanticism, you see in this next slide, where Jacques-Louis David's numerous students, actually these students who were trained under David, they moved towards romanticism, right. So the three artists are Gros, Antoine Jean Gros, Annie-Louis Giraud, right, Giraudet, and Ingres, right. So these three artists were the early artists who were moving from neoclassicism to romanticism, right. So now let us quickly move to the next slide and see the first painting by Gros, right, Antoine Jean Gros. This painting is called Napoleon at the Pest House at Jaffa. Napoleon was invaded Jaffa, occupied Jaffa, and it was the time when Jaffa was infested with plague, right, and the plague victims were kept in a sort of a separate place, right. So Napoleon actually visits, after he occupies, he visits this place, and you can see right in the center Napoleon is touching the body of a plague victim, right. So this is a kind of a painting, this is a kind of a composition where Napoleon is touching the plague victim. It shows the compassionate side of Napoleon, right, compassionate, fearless leader. By showing his kindness, by touching, he is showing all these aspects, all these features, right. So the very visit of Napoleon, so it is actually to kind of elevate Napoleon to this status of a kind man, right, a fearless man. Well, Napoleon did visit this particular house where these victims were kept, but what he did was he ordered later to kill them, to poison all these plague victims and kill them. So here the composition sort of dramatizes the event, the visit of Napoleon, as if Napoleon is more divine and he is touching, and if you look at the paintings of early Renaissance where St. Peter's heals the blind, St. Peter's heals the deceased and all. So you can compare where Christ healing the deceased. So all this history is there when it comes to painting. So Napoleon is pushed into that kind of a legacy where he is almost like equal to these divine figures, right. And you can see this is set in an architecture which is not the Roman architecture but Moorish architecture, right. It is more the eastern side, the east, but not the west. So the east has always been exotic for the Westerners, for the Europeans. So you can see a sort of an exotic element, exotic touch in this setting, the environment, the Moorish architecture in which the entire composition is set, and the light is falling in a very dramatic manner, and it almost like a theater that is happening in front of you, right. Let us move to the next. And how Romanticism has evolved, right. The Romanticism has evolved because of a sort of a criticism towards the neoclassical era, because of a criticism towards the age of reason. Neoclassical era is also known as age of reason, which also coincides with the age of enlightenment. So it is a very fertile, very important movement in history. So someone called Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a philosopher, and in this slide you can see the French philosopher who advocated freedom, right. So concept of freedom contributed to the rise of Romanticism, so which desired not only political freedom but also freedom of thought, feeling, action, worship, speech and taste, right. So this is a sort of a contrast to the age of reason, right, to neoclassicism, where neoclassicism advocated reason and rationality, not feeling, right. So it was not freedom but submission to virtue, right? You can't do anything and everything, but you will do according to the virtues, right? So, and honor, and we have seen the table. So, Romanticism advocated feeling, action, and speech and taste, right? So, this sort of opened a new side of the human, new side of the modern human being, right? So, we will see some of the artworks, some of the paintings, and see how we can see artists have responded to this. In the next slide, you see the continuation of what we have seen in relation to Rousseau. Individuals claim their own freedom and with it a unique subjectivity, right? You don't submit yourself, but you develop a sort of a unique subjectivity, a unique individuality, right? Romanticism believed that the path to freedom was through imagination and feeling rather than through reason and thinking. This is a very important point where Romanticism differs from the reason, the rationality of Neoclassicism, right? It is imagination and feeling rather than reason and thinking. So, the freedom is in imagination and feeling. That is the Romantic idea. And Romanticism, of course, again goes back to Gothic, and they drew a lot from the Gothic, the fantastic, the occult, and the macabre, right, and the sublime, right. So, it is the terror, the feeling of terror and all, and which is why they also relied on the dreams, right, the subconscious. And the next slide that you see, this particular image by the painting is by Henry Fuseli. It is called The Nightmare, right, and you see there is a figure that is sleeping, a female figure, and right on the female figure you have this grotesque figure, a sort of a demon sitting, right. So, this is not something that we see regularly every day, it is not reasonable, but it is the dream, and dream is more about imagination and feeling, right. So, the entire light and the dramatic sort of a composition, the entire drama also kind of inspires some kind of a sublime feeling in us, right, rather than a sense of virtue, right. So, another painting is by William Blake. This painting that you see is God in Ancient Days by William Blake, right. So, William Blake was a Romantic poet, as we know. He also did a lot of paintings. So, he derived the compositions of many of his paintings and poems from spirits and dreams, right. Rationalism's search for material explanations of world stifled human nature and spirituality. So, he thought that rationalism stifles human nature and spirituality. So, he believed in dreams and the spirits. So, he drew his imagination from spirits and dreams, right. So, if you move to the next artist, who is Goya, who is a Spanish artist. So, this particular image that you see on the screen is about the sleep of reason produces monsters, right. So, Goya thought that he welcomed the revolution's promise of political enlightenment, but he became disillusioned by the that enlightenment, the political enlightenment, when he hoped for reforms were short-lived. The reforms that were promised by the Enlightenment movement were short-lived for Goya, and this particular image tells where the man, he is sleeping here, which is nothing but reason. The reason, when the reason is sleeping, you have all these monsters that are coming. So, this is one of the etching print from the series called Los Caprico, right. So, he did several such images. And let us move to the other artist, who is Géricault, and this painting is about a contemporary event that happened at that point of time, and you can look at the painting first, where it is it is composed in this pyramidal structure, where you have a black man on the top of the pyramid. And it's a very dramatic composition where the figures are almost touching the bottom of the canvas, and it is about a raft, it is about a shipwreck. Okay. In 1856, Medusa was a ship which was going to African coast, right. Medusa was the name of the ship. So, the French frigate Medusa ran around on a reef due to the incompetent captain. The captain was a political appointee, he did not know much about navigation. So the ship was wrecked. So in an attempt to survive, 150 passengers built a makeshift raft with the pieces of the ship, the wooden pieces, disintegrated ship. The raft drifted for 12 days in the sea, and they didn't have any water, they didn't have food. So out of 150 passengers, only 15 survived. Okay. So finally the ship was spotted and then they were rescued, and the people and the society of France was scandalized by this, right. So it was very much a popular story of news story at that point of time, and Géricault painted it for almost 2 years, right. So you see here, it is not about the virtue, it is about the human pain, the human emotion and the feeling of the death, right. So let us quickly look at these landscape paintings, because nature was very important for the Romantic artists. So the Romantic interest in the landscape as an independent and respected genre in Germany, England and United States emerges at this point of time, and also with a sense of exotic, right. And this was a time of industrial revolution, so nature was going away, right. When the nature was going away, people were trying to kind of cling to the nature. So this slide that you see on the screen is by Caspar David Friedrich, a German landscape painter, and you see Romantic landscape. So you can see a landscape in which a dilapidated Gothic church is kept, and it is actually about a funeral. You have people carrying a coffin in the foreground and moving towards this dilapidated church, and the entire mood is exaggerated by this jarring, very gnarling sort of trees that you have, and it is set in this evening where the day is sort of closing, right. So the entire landscape is it gives us a feeling of sublimity, a sense of fear, right. So which is very different from what we have seen in the context of neoclassical paintings, right. So another painting by Caspar David Friedrich, as you see here, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, right. So here you see, this may be the artist himself, where he is looking at the nature, right, and you see the sublime nature that is shown, and nature gets objectified at this point of time. We don't see nature being privileged so much earlier, right. Nature was a background but not the subject matter. So he said the artist should not only paint what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. So inside, what you see inside becomes more important, right. So another artist is Jean Constable, and he painted this English landscape, and you can see here the experience of the English landscape could be seen in the clouds, in the kind of material quality of the nature here, right. So the last artist is William Turner. Turner painted seascapes and landscapes like this after John Constable, and he strove to portray the uncontrollable and frightening power of nature, right. So you can see in this, he sort of painting the sea and very abstracting nature. This is the power of nature. So we have seen the contrast between neoclassicism and romanticism is a contrast between rationality and feeling, right. Thank you.